In the previous few slides that go between the last presentation and this one, I put some data down on some of those effects that I had talked about from that happened as a result of trade. Now what I want to do is look at the sources of comparative advantage and go through this list that I have below here. And Krugman and Wells do a pretty good job of going through this as well. And I just want to go through each of these and kind of make sense of them. And you might want to read the Krugman and Wells section on this as well, because they also have their own factors on this. The standard model is called the Heckscher-Ohlin model, and it's after two economists. And it basically says that what determines the pattern of trade are resource or factor endowments. And this does a pretty good job of explaining trade between very different countries. So it would be, you know, if you wanted to explain between the US and say Malaysia, or between Britain and Indonesia, then this would do a pretty good job, because what it looks at is what are the factors of production that you have a relative abundance of. Okay, so for instance, if you have a lot of high-skilled labor, then you would be relatively endowed with high-skilled labor, and as a result of that, you'd also be less endowed with low-skilled labor. If you have that, you have to be sort of relative with one. So if you have a lot of one, it means you have less of another relatively on that. So some countries will have a lot of low-skilled labor, some will have a lot of high-skilled labor, some will have a lot of capital, some will have a lot of land. And so what the Heckscher-Ohlin model says is that your comparative advantage will be based on those factors that are relatively abundant. So, and then what that means is you'll specialize according to those abundant factors. So again, if the US has a lot of high-skilled labor, we'll specialize in the production of goods that have as an input a lot of high-skilled labor. If we're a country that has a lot of sort of moderate skilled labor, so if I think about South Korea when it was in the process of industrializing, so think about 1960s or so, what they had wasn't necessarily low-skilled labor. They had a population that didn't necessarily have high technical skills, but had really good basic mathematics skills. And so they're really good at dealing with manufacturing settings. And so they had a relative advantage in those areas. And you can think of some cases, resource endowments can be even things like climate. So obviously, if you're going to produce wine, you need a certain climatic factors, and they don't exist everywhere. So there are some things in resource endowments that are just given on that. But later on, we'll talk a little bit about how some of these supposed resources can actually be developed. And I think that's particularly true of a lot of the East Asian economies out there. So that's the standard model of trade, and it's sort of the standard model of where comparative advantage comes from. And again, I think it explains trade between very different countries. It doesn't do a very good job of explaining what's known as intra-industry trade, which often happens between countries that are very similar. So, you know, we both import and export automobiles from different countries that are out there, countries that are very similar. We do a lot of our trade with Canada, a lot of our trade with Britain, some with Germany, and while we're different countries, we have a lot of the same resource endowments that those other countries have. And I don't think the Heckscher-Ohlin model does a very good job of explaining that, but it does explain trade between the US and Mexico, trade between the US and China, and trade between the US and the Philippines and places like that. So now another source of comparative advantage is technology and diffusion patterns. So, you know, the US is for the most part a technological leader. And so in periods where new technologies really matter, we tend to surge ahead in some respects. And in periods where it's all about copying technology, East Asia does a much better job. That's diffusion. So technology can also govern the comparative advantage or the pattern of trade. Now, one of the things that Paul Krugman won his Nobel Prize for is the idea of strategic trade policy, that there's all sorts of different policies that you can put place to sort of help in determining that pattern of a comparative advantage. So it's good to read him on this, but I'm just going to give you one example. So trade rules really matter, and how they're set can actually determine a comparative advantage. Let's take thinking about the automobile industry and going back to the 1990s. In that period, the US had regional content rules and Mexico had domestic content rules. Both of those mean how much of an automobile had to be produced either domestically or regionally. Well, at the time, you had an appreciating German currency, and they were thinking about where to locate their VW plant. And so they chose Mexico over the US in the Leon area, in part because Mexico had these domestic content rules and the US had regional content, so they could hit both of them by locating in Mexico. So it's an arcane trade rule, but it actually made a huge difference. It actually was a source of why Mexico had an advantage over that. You can look at Lesotho, and their textile industry is almost wholly the result of some trade rules that give them preferential trade preference on that. Is that just trade preference on that? It's the AGAO, but it's something that gives them sort of preference. Other than that, they probably wouldn't even have that industry. So comparative advantage is sometimes based on rules that have been set. Protectionism. This can be a source of comparative advantage. So particularly if you're really good at setting tariffs, quotas, and subsidies, they can also cause problems, but they can also sort of produce differential outcomes. And then there's something called the Linder model, which is about overlapping demand. So you might have an advantage in an industry because you have a really good or really extensive demand for the product. Like a lot of product development happens in the US because they want to be close to the largest market. You can also think of this model when you're thinking of, if France consumes a lot of wine, the Linder model might explain why they have a wine industry other than the quality of the wine and things like that. Same thing if we're thinking about the Czech Republic and beer. And so you're really thinking, or Belgium and beer. So when you're thinking about this, sometimes demand can actually create a comparative advantage on that. Vernon came up with the idea of product cycles. So there's a lot of complexities in this, in that we often think of goods as having one set of characteristics throughout their life cycle, but we can also think of them as having different characteristics. So in the 1960s, an economist by the name of Vasily Leontiev found that the content of US imports had a higher capital content than our exports. And that's a conundrum if you think about the Heckscher-Ohlin model. But what was really going on is that the goods were being produced in the US when high-skilled labor was the most important factor. And then as they moved along their product cycle to a period when labor became the most important input, then they were moving offshore. So we were importing these goods, but it was not so much that we were importing a single good, we were importing a good at a certain time in its life cycle. So that can be a source of comparative advantage, or at least show how it plays out in different areas. Geography can make a difference. One might be just the ports and things that you're located, that you have as a location. But it also might be that if you're thinking about, say, trade between the US and Canada, that it seems like you're exporting and importing, but it's far easier to move goods from Detroit to Sault Ste. Marie than it is to move goods from Detroit to, say, Los Angeles. So the geography can come in quite a bit on this, that's out there. Economies of scale. This is that idea that as you get larger, you get efficiency gains in that. And so this can also happen if this is one of the oldest ways of sort of creating an advantage in an industry, is to grant monopoly power to a particular producer so that they can sort of sell it, reach a minimum efficient scale and undercut the foreign competition that's out there. So economies of scale can also be a source of comparative advantage. And as I mentioned earlier in the Chinese, when talking about the Chinese case, exchange rates can be a real comparative advantage. A country like South Korea did really well by constantly devaluing their currency, the won, and keeping, even as domestic unit costs of labor were going up, on the international realm, they were actually dropping in a real sense because of the devaluation of the currency. So lots of factors. I think that Krugman has a great diagram, which I've brought about, what am I saying? Recapped here, just below. Which shows, the various things that can cause trade. So there's trade, it's caused by differences between countries. This can be in technology or it can be in resources. Again, that hexaroline is the one that's important for that. In technology, they can be exogenous or they can be endogenous or created within the country and leading to learning by doing. I think the South Korean case is an incredible case of a country that learned by doing. And what they did is they did this sort of incremental pattern where they moved from lower order industries to higher order industries in these plans over time that moved them sequentially to higher and higher value added industries, all the way up to the high tech industries that are out there. And then you can also have trade because of increasing returns, and then trade because of oligopolistic or monopolistic behavior. So these are all sort of sources of comparative advantage that are out there. Now, if we sort of look at this is looking at factor endowments in different countries. This is back in 1993, but you can see China, when they were closed off, they really focused not so much even on unskilled labor industries. They often had land-intensive industries. And so it was a big shift that they had on that towards the unskilled labor, because that's where they have their comparative advantage according to hexaroline. And thinking about that shift that takes place towards unskilled labor, and then later on they developed the skilled labor, you can actually see this in the landscape. So you see a lot of land that was being used for rice cultivation sort of shifting to manufacturing. So if you go outside Shanghai, you can see rice fields right next to the battery plants and stuff like that, kind of shifting from one to the other. So, okay. So moving on, thinking about some of the goods that we sort of get from Mexico, what does this trade look like if we pick a country like Mexico? And you can see that it's all over the place. We get a certain amount of consumer goods, a certain amount of industrial inputs, a certain amount of investment goods, and then not so much services, because we usually have the advantage in services. We export a lot of services to Mexico on that. So this is just kind of getting a feel for those particular aspects there. Now, coming back to the trade war, one of the things I think it's useful for you to do is to look at that webinar from the Outdoor Industry Association. Don't watch it or listen to it at all. It's very long, and but if you watch maybe 5 or 10 minutes of it, you get a feel for just how complex dealing with protectionism and dealing with tariffs are. But I also have a little diagram here, down here. Let me skip down. In which this is what it sort of looks like, where there's, you can sort of see they're all over the place on it. Some of them ad valorem, some of them are per unit. And how do you get these particular numbers? Well, they're really the outcome of a political process. So when we get to that, we'll sort of think about that in more detail. Okay. Now, thinking about comparative advantage on the aspects of things, this is sort of looking at what is the leading export from different countries. And so you get a feel for how diversified a country's exports are by looking at their leading one. And you look at Germany, and it's pretty diverse. Their leading one is about 17%. Look at Saudi Arabia, and of course, fuels make up almost 93% of their exports. So some countries have a nice diverse set. Some focus on a simple one that's out there. And trying to get a feel for comparative advantage, it's often not all or nothing. So if you look at between the United States and Japan, this is from the period 1990s to the 2000s. This is about relative comparative advantage in essence, because we still produce some of all of these goods, and so did they, but they seem to have a larger comparative advantage in the area of semiconductors and we do in chemicals. So just sort of thinking about this, there's not perfect specialization. Both of these graphics show that on this. So the same sort of order here, looking at the areas where we seem to have a relative comparative advantage on that. Now, one last thing to think about on comparative advantage is this idea of whether or not it's natural or acquired. So sometimes it's just about advantages that the country was sort of born with that are out there. And so you think about Canada and lumber, and Israel and citrus fruit, and Mexico and tomatoes. Those are a lot about climate and those aspects, or Jamaica and having a whole bunch of aluminum ore. Even ones that seem to be partially about climate also are partially created. So if you think about Italy and wine, certainly they have the climate for it. That's a necessary but probably not a sufficient condition. It's about developing those vineyards and developing the industry and developing the expertise. All of those things over time really matter. And if you think about the US and wheat and corn, we had a lot of land, but a lot of it had to be irrigated, had to be developed in various ways. And so both of those are partially created. But then you think about the ones in which the comparative advantage is created over time. You think there's no real reason for Hong Kong to have a textile industry necessarily, but they developed the skills that made them very successful in that industry. Japan, their automobile industry is mostly developed. South Korea, there's no reason that South Korea should have a steel industry. But they do have some decent ports and stuff like that, but it's really about acquiring the skills that made them competitive in that industry. And the same thing with Switzerland and the watch industry. It isn't that the Swiss are naturally better at making watches or anything like that. They developed the industry over time. So in thinking about these and thinking about comparative advantage, it makes it a little bit more difficult because you have to think about the fact that some countries can create these advantages over time. Either by infrastructure, either by increasing skills in certain sectors, maybe having a good marketing board. There's all sorts of things that come into play when you're thinking about a particular industry doing well in a particular country. Some of those things are natural advantages. Some of those things are created. Some of those are created at the firm level. So the classic one is to think about Nokia in Finland. There was almost no division between the country and the company on this, that the advantages of the country were the advantages of Nokia and vice versa. Other times you have countries that have developed clusters of things. So in the US, we have Silicon Valley, and we have the area of 128 outside of Boston. And those are created advantages for the development of new ideas, and they're not natural in any sense. So when you think about comparative advantage, you have to think about it as both natural and acquired on that. And so thinking about this dynamic comparative advantage, this opens the door and for some industrial policy, picking winners and losers. This is tricky. Sometimes governments do this horribly well. Sometimes they do it amazingly well. If you look at the case of Taiwan and the semiconductor industry, they do not have that industry if the government doesn't consistently make the right decisions in it. So they had almost everything going against them, but they developed the expertise, they developed the resources and the infrastructure and the sort of institutional setting for that industry to thrive. And so there are cases where this has worked really well. There are also cases where it hasn't worked well at all. So there are various ways you can get into it. How do you promote industries? You might allow them to have a break against antitrust policy. You might give them tax incentives. A lot of times there's subsidies for research and development. A lot of things that East Asia did was they provided low interest rate loans or no interest rate loans that are out there. And then, of course, trade protection, at least for a period of time, sometimes really helps an industry get off their feet on those other things. So again, one of the things that a lot of countries that have done this over time is they have this aspect of learning by doing. They'll often move step by step through different industry categories on this moving up over time. So, okay, so I do, on the other video that I made, I went through the idea of how a tariff operates. I just want to recap this here, because I think you want to see it in two places on that. And I went through using the whiteboard in the other video, but since a lot of the protectionism that's going on right now is centered around tariffs, and it's a pretty old method of protecting that's out there. One of the keys is if you think about the world price without a tariff, and then you'll follow that across, and you'll get the domestic supply, which is at that Q1S, and the domestic demand, which is at that Q1D. And so the difference between those two are your imports. And what a tariff does is it adds to that price, not to domestic producers, but to foreign goods coming into the US. Essentially, it's paid when it comes into the US. And so, and it's paid by US importing firms usually. It's often passed on to the consumer, depending on how much they have the ability to do that. But it also means that domestic prices will usually go up. So there'll still be a price prevailing, but that higher price domestically means that the quantity supplied will go up, and that higher price means that the quantity demanded will go down. So you move to Q2 S and D, and imports have shrunk down to the difference between those two. And then the government also gets tariff revenue, which is the difference between the price without the tariff and the price with the tariff. And that rectangular box there represents the tariff revenue that you get there. So if we're thinking about this, if this is a steel tariff, which they went in place under Trump just a year and a half ago or so, and these will help domestic producers, probably hurt domestic consumers of steel, and probably domestic consumers of any other goods that use steel in the production process. It's going to hurt producers who use steel in the production process because it's going to drive up the price. Probably hurt foreign producers. It'll help the government by giving them some revenue, although tariff revenues are not huge now relative to what we get from income and other taxes that are out there. It'll also it'll help the workers in this industry, but it might hurt the workers in other industries that are out there. This becomes a little bit more complex about the domestic firms if it's a good that you're actually importing within intra-firm. So I'm having you guys look at that Columbia Sportswear, and that's one in which a lot of the production is elsewhere, but then they're selling it here. So it doesn't even help the domestic firm on that, and that's taking place. So it's a fairly complex picture. I did go through it on that video in more detail, but just to kind of bring it forth once again. So I think that brings us down to there are other ways to protect the industries. As I mentioned earlier, one is giving subsidies. And you can see the difference. Tariff will increase the price of the good domestically. Usually a subsidy to a producer will decrease the price. It'll shift the supply curve to the right, and you get a lower price and an increased quantity as a result of that. The other thing that you can do is you can give a monopoly so that you move further out on that minimum efficient scale. Those are long-run average costs. And so for an industry, say like an airplane production industry, there's a huge amount of fixed costs, so it takes a lot of airplanes to reach that minimum efficient scale. And so if you give a monopoly to a domestic producer of airplanes, they might actually get more competitive on world markets by producing enough to actually reach that minimum efficient scale. And of course, we've already talked about the currency. That to me is the most effective way to protect, but it does run the risk of causing inflation that's out there. So that's looking at trade and tariffs and trade wars, and to try to set you up for reading some of those articles. And I will see you on next week. Have a good day.